Suddha Bhakata Charanarenu Bhajana Anukula Suddha Bhakata Charanarenu Bhajana Anukula Bhakata Seva Parama Siddhi Pamelati Karamula Bhakata Seva Parama Siddhi Pamelati Karamula Madhavati Ti Bhakti Janani Jatane Palana Kori Madhavati Ti Bhakti Janani Jatane Palana Kori Krishna Basati Basati Boli Parama Adare Bori Krishna Basati Basati Boli Parama Adare Bori Gora Maharaja Sabastane Koraro Bhamanarange Gora Maharaja Sabastane Koraro Bhamanarange Sesavastana Heri Boami Panayabhakati Sange Sesavastana Heri Boami Panayabhakata Sange Mridanga Bhaja Sunite Mana Abasara Sadajache Mridanga Bhaja Sunite Mana Abasara Sadajache Gora Vita Kirtana Suni Anande Hridaya Nache Gora Vita Kirtana Suni Anande Hridaya Nache Jugala Murti Dekhiya Mora Parama Ananda Hoya যুগল মূর্তি দেখিয়া মোরা পরম আনন্দ হয়। প্রসাদ সেবা করিতে হয় সকল প্রপঞ্চ জয়। প্রসাদ সেবা করিতে হয় সকল প্রপঞ্চ জয়। যেদিন গৃহে ভজন দেখি গৃহেতে গোলক ভায়। যেদিন গৃহে ভজন দেখি গৃহেতে গোলক ভায়। চরণ সেতু দেখিয়া গঙ্গা সুখ সীমা পায়। চরণ সেতু দেখিয়া গঙ্গা সুখ সীমা পায়। তুলসী দেখি জুড়ায়া প্রাণ মাধব তোষানি জানি। তুলসী দেখি জুড়ায়া প্রাণ মাধব তোষানি জানি। গৌর প্রিয় সখ সেবনে জীবন সার্থক মানি। গৌর প্রিয় সখ সেবনে জীবন সার্থক মানি। ভক্তি বিনা কৃষ্ণ ভজনে অনুকূল পায় যাহা। ভক্তি বিনা কৃষ্ণ ভজনে অনুকূল পায় যাহা। প্রতি দিবসে পরম সুখে স্বীকার করো এটা। প্রতি দিবসে পরম সুখে স্বীকার করো এটা। শুদ্ধ ভক্ত চরণ রেণু ভজন অনুকূল। ভক্ত সেবা পরম সিদ্ধি প্রেমলাতি করো মূল। Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopidana Vallabha Girivaradhari Gopidana Vallabha Girivaradhari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jasodanandana Vraja Janaranjana Jasodanandana Vraja Janaranjana Jamuna Tira Vanachari Jamuna Tira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Prabhupada 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 Jai Om Vishubhat Paramahansa Parivar Jaikacharya Ashtotara Sata Sri Srimati Divine Grace et Sri Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai Jai Om Vishubhat Paramahansa Parivar Jaikacharya Ashtotara Sata Sri Srimati Divine Grace Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Goswami Maharaj Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai Ananta Koti Vaishnavrinda Ki Jai Namacharya Srila Haridas Thakur Ki Jai Prem Sikho Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhara Sivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Ki Jai Sri Sri Radha Krishna Gop Gopinath Shyama Kunda Radha Kund Giri Govardhan Ki Jai Vrindavan Dham Ki Jai Mayapur Navadvip Dham Ki Jai Jagannath Puri Dham Ki Jai Ganga Mai Ki Jai Jamuna Mai Ki Jai Srimati Tulasi Devi Ki Jai Bhakti Devi Ki Jai Sri Harinam Sankirtan Ki Jai Sri Sri Radha Madan Mohan Ki Jai Sri Sri Gaunitai Ki Jai Sri Sri Jagannath Subhadra Baladev Ki Jai Gaura Premanandi All glories to the Sambhavatis All glories to the Sambhavatis All glories to the Sambhavatis All glories to Sri Guru Sri Gauranga All glories to Srila Prabhupada Sri Sri Gaunitai Ki Jai Sri Sri Radha Madan Mohan Ki Jai Sri Sri Jagannath Subhadra Baladev Ki Jai Hare Krishna. So we are reading again from Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita, second volume, chapter entitled Stay High Forever. September 23rd, this is the year 1966 in New York. It was Radhashtami, the appearance day of Srimati Radharani, Lord Krishna's eternal consort. Prabhupada held his second initiation. Keith became Kirtanananda. Steve became Satsvarupa. Bruce became Brahmananda. And Chuck became Achyutananda. It was another festive day with a fire sacrifice in Prabhupada's front room and a big feast. Prabhupada lived amid the drug culture in a neighborhood where the young people were almost desperately attempting to alter their consciousness, whether by drugs or by some other means, whatever was available. Prabhupada assured them that they could easily achieve the higher consciousness they desired by chanting Hare Krishna. It was inevitable that in explaining Krishna consciousness, he would make allusions to the drug experience, even if only to show that the two were contrary paths. He was familiar already with Indian sadhus who took ganja and hashish on the plea of aiding their meditations. And even before he had left India, hippie tourists had become a familiar sight on the streets of Delhi. The hippies liked India because of the cultural mystique. and easy access to drugs. They would meet their Indian counterparts, who assured them that taking hashish was spiritual, and then they would return to America and perpetrate their misconceptions of Indian spiritual culture. It was the way of life. The local head shops carried a full line of paraphernalia: marijuana, LSD, peyote, cocaine, and hard drugs like heroin and barbiturates were easily purchased on the streets and in the parks. Underground newspapers reported important news on the drugs scene, featured a cartoon character named Captain High, and ran crossword puzzles that only a seasoned head could answer. Head means drug addict. Prabhupada had to teach that Krishna consciousness was beyond the revered LSD trip. Do you think taking LSD can produce ecstasy and higher consciousness? He once asked his storefront audience. Then just imagine a room full of LSD. Krishna consciousness is like that. People would regularly come in and ask Swamiji's disciples, "Do you get high from this?" And the devotees would answer, "Oh yes, you can get high just by chanting. Why don't you try it?" Greg Scharf, Brahmananda's brother, had not tried LSD, but he wanted higher consciousness. So he decided to try the chanting. Greg says, "I was 18. Everyone at the storefront had taken LSD, and I thought maybe I should do, because I wanted to feel like part of the crowd. So I asked Umapati, 'Hey, Umapati, do you think I should try LSD? Because I don't know what you guys are talking about.' He said no, that Swamiji said you did not need LSD, and I never did take it, so I guess it was okay." Hayagriva, have you ever heard of LSD? It's a psychedelic drug that comes like a pill, and if you take it, you can get religious ecstasies. Do you think this can help my spiritual life? Prabhupada, you don't need to take anything for your spiritual life. Your spiritual life is already there. End of quote. Had anyone else said such a thing, Hayagriva would never have agreed with him. But because Swamiji seemed so absolutely positive, therefore, there was no question of not agreeing. Satswarupa says, "I knew Swamiji was in a state of exalted consciousness, and I was hoping that somehow he could teach the process to me. In the privacy of his room, I asked him, 'Is there any spiritual advancement that you can make from which you won't fall back?' By his answer, yes, I was convinced that my own attempts to be spiritual on LSD, only to fall down later, could be replaced by a total spiritual life such as Swamiji had. I could see he was convinced, and then I was convinced." Greg says, LSD was like the spiritual drug at the times, and Swamiji was the only one who dared to speak out against it, saying it was nonsense. I think that was the first battle he had to conquer in trying to promote his movement on the Lower East Side. Even those who came regularly to the storefront thought that LSD was good. End of quote. Probably the most famous experiments with LSD in those days were by Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, Harvard psychology instructors who studied the effects of the drug published their findings in professional journals, and advocated the use of LSD for self-realization and fulfillment. After being fired from Harvard, Timothy Leary went on to become a national priest of LSD, and for some time ran an LSD commune in Millbrook, New York. When the members of the Millbrook commune heard about the Swami on the Lower East Side, who led his followers in the chant that got you high, they began visiting the storefront. One night, a group of about 10 hippies from Millbrook came to Swamiji's kirtan. They all chanted, not so much in worship of Krishna as to see what kind of high the chanting could produce. And after the lecture, a Millbrook leader asked about drugs. Prabhupada replied that drugs were not necessary for spiritual life, that they could not produce spiritual consciousness, and that all drug-induced religious visions were simply hallucinations. To realize God was not so easy or cheap that one could do it just by taking a pill or smoking. Chanting Hare Krishna, he explained, was a purifying process to uncover one's pure consciousness. Taking drugs would increase the covering and bar one from self-realization. But have you ever taken LSD? The question now became a challenge. No, Prabhupada replied. I have never taken any of these things, not even cigarettes or tea. If you haven't taken it, then how can you say what it is? The Millbrookers looked around smiling. 2 or 3 even burst out with laughter, and they snapped their fingers, thinking the Swami had been checkmated. I have not taken, Prabhupada replied regally from his dais, but my disciples have taken all these things, marijuana, LSD, many times, and they have given them all up. You can hear from them. Hayagriva, you can speak. And Hayagriva sat up a little and spoke out in his stentorian best. Stentorian is a classical way of a very loud voice and grave, deep voice. Hayagriva speaks. Well, no matter how high you go on LSD, you eventually reach a peak and then you have to come back down, just like traveling into outer space in a rocket ship. He gave one of Swamiji's familiar examples. Your spacecraft can travel very far away from the Earth for thousands of miles, day after day, but it cannot simply go on traveling and traveling. Eventually, it must land. On LSD, we experience going up, but we always have to come down again. That's not spiritual consciousness. When you actually attain spiritual or Krishna consciousness, you stay high. Because you go to Krishna, you don't have to come down. You can stay high forever. And of course, Prabhupada was sitting in his back room with Hayagriva and Umapati and other disciples. The evening meeting had just ended, and the visitors from Millbrook had gone. Krishna consciousness is so nice, Swamiji. Umapati spoke up. You just get higher and higher, and you don't come down. Prabhupada smiled. Yes, that's right. No more coming down, Umapati said, laughing, and the others also began to laugh. Some clapped their hands, repeating, no more coming down. The conversation inspired Hayagriva and Umapati to produce a new handbill titled Stay High Forever. No more coming down. Practice Krishna consciousness. Expand your consciousness by practicing the transcendental sound vibration. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. The leaflet went on to extol Krishna consciousness over any other high. It includes phrases like, "and all bring downs," and "turn on," and it spoke against employing artificially induced methods of self-realization and expanded consciousness. Someone objected to the flyers playing too much of the hippie mentality, but Prabhupada said it was all right. Greg says, when these drug people on the Lower East Side came and talked to Swamiji, he was so patient with them. He was speaking on a philosophy which they had never heard before. When someone takes LSD, they are really into themselves, and they don't hear properly when someone talks to them. So Swamiji would make particular points, and they wouldn't understand him. So he would have to make the same point again. He was very patient with these people, and he would not give in to their claim that LSD was a bona fide spiritual aid to self-realization. October 1966. Tompkins Square Park was the park on the Lower East Side. On the south, it was bordered by 7th Street with its 4- and 5-storied brownstone tenements. On the north side was 10th with more brownstones, but in better condition, and a very old small building that housed the Tompkins Square branch of the New York Public Library. On Avenue B, the park's east border stood St. Bridget's Church, built in 1848, when the neighborhood had been entirely Irish. Irish are traditionally Catholics. The church, school, and rectory still occupied much of the block, and the west border of the park, Avenue A, was lined with tiny old candy stores selling newspapers, magazines, cigarettes, and egg cream sodas at the counter. There were also a few bars, several grocery stores, and a couple of Slavic restaurants specializing in inexpensive vegetable broths, which brought Ukrainians and hippies side by side for bodily nourishment. The park's 10 acres had many tall trees, but at least half the park was paved. A network of 5-foot-high, heavy wrought iron fences weaved through the park, lining the walkways and protecting the grass. The fences and the many walkways and entrances to the park gave it the effect of a maze. Since the weather was still warm and it was Sunday, the park was crowded with people. Almost all the space on the benches that lined the walkways was occupied. There were old people, mostly Ukrainians, dressed in outdated suits and sweaters, even in the warm weather, sitting together in clans, talking. There were many children in the park also, mostly Puerto Ricans and blacks, but also fair-haired, hard-faced slum kids racing around on bikes or playing with balls and frisbees. Frisbee, you know? Frisbee is a plastic made big like this. It looks like a star. I mean, 2, 4, things like this, and you throw it in the air, and it will turn like this. It will fly for some time, about 20 meters or 50 meters, like this. And they are taking it, and they are throwing back like this. They are playing with this called frisbee. Pardon? Oh, sometimes, yeah. You can make it come back also. That's how you are experts. Then, the basketball and handball courts were mostly taken by the teenagers. And as always, there were plenty of loose running dogs. A marble miniature gazebo, 4 pillars and a roof, with a drinking fountain inside, was a remnant from the old days, 1891, according to the inscription. On its 4 sides were the words hope, faith, charity, and temperance. But someone has sprayed the whole structure with black paint, making crude designs and illegible names and initials. Today, a bench had been taken over by several conga and bongo drummers, and the whole park pulsed with their demanding rhythms. And the hippies were there, different from the others. The bearded bohemian men and their long-haired young girlfriends, dressed in old blue jeans, were still an unusual sight. Even in the Lower East Side melting pot, their presence created tension. They were from middle-class families, and so they had not been driven to the slums by dire economic necessity. This created conflicts in their dealings with the underprivileged immigrants, and the hippies' well-known proclivity for psychedelic drugs, their revolt against their families and affluence, and their absorption in the avant-garde sometimes made them the jeered minority among their neighbors. But the hippies just wanted to do their own thing and create their own revolution for love and peace, so usually they were tolerated, although not appreciated. There were various groups among the young and hip at Tompkins Square Park. There were friends who had gone to the same school together, who took the same drug together, or who agreed on a particular philosophy of art, literature, politics, or metaphysics. There were lovers. There were groups hanging out together for reasons undecipherable, except for the common purpose of doing their own thing. And there were others who lived like hermits. A loner would sit on a park bench analyzing the effects of cocaine, looking up at the strangely rustling green leaves of the trees and the blue sky above the tenements, and then down to the garbage at his feet, as he helplessly followed his mind from fear to illumination, to disgust, to hallucination, on, until after a few hours, the drug began to wear off and he was again a common stranger. Sometimes they would sit up all night, spaced out in the park, until at last, in the light of morning, they would stretch out on benches to sleep. Hippies especially took to the park on Sundays. They at least passed through the park on their way to St. Mark's Place, Greenwich Village, or the Lexington Avenue subway at Astor Place, or the IND subway at Houston and Second, or to catch an uptown bus on First Avenue, a downtown bus on Second, or across town on 9th. Or they went to the park just to get out of their apartments and sit together in the open air, to get high again, to talk, or to walk through the park's maze of pathways. But whatever the hippies' diverse interests and drives, the Lower East Side was an essential part of the mystique. It was not just a dirty slum. It was the best place in the world to conduct the experiment in consciousness. For all its filth and threat of violence and the confined life of its brownstone tenements, the Lower East Side was still the forefront of the revolution in mind expansion. Unless you were living there and taking psychedelics or marijuana, or at least intellectually pursuing the quest for free personal religion, you were not enlightened, and you were not taking part in the most progressive evolution of human consciousness. And it was this searching, a quest beyond the humdrum existence of the ordinary, materialistic, straight American, that brought unity to the otherwise eclectic gathering of hippies on the Lower East Side. Into this chaotic pageant, Swamiji entered with his followers and sat down to hold a kirtan. 3 or 4 devotees who arrived ahead of him selected an open area of the park, put out the oriental carpet Robert Nelson had donated, sat down on it, and began playing kartals and chanting Hare Krishna. Immediately, some boys rode up on their bicycles, braked just short of the carpet, and stood astride their bikes, curiously and irreverently staring. Other passers-by gathered to listen. Meanwhile, Swamiji, accompanied by half a dozen disciples, was walking the 8 blocks from the storefront. Brahmananda carried the harmonium and the Swami's drum. Kirtanananda, who was now shaven-headed at Swamiji's request and dressed in loose, flowing canary yellow robes, created an extra sensation. Drivers pulled their cars over to have a look, their passengers leaning forward, agape at the outrageous dress and shaved head. As the group passed the store, people inside would poke each other and indicate the spectacle. People came to the windows of their tenements, taking in the Swami and his group as if a parade were passing. The Puerto Rican tough guys, especially, could not restrain themselves from exaggerated reactions. "Hey, Buddha," they taunted. "Hey, you forgot to change your pajamas." They made shrill scream as if imitating India war whoops they had heard in Hollywood westerns. Shall we continue? 9 o'clock. Shall we continue? Huh? "Hey, Arabs," exclaimed one heckler, who began imitating what he thought was an Eastern dance. They were suspicious. Some, however, like Irvin Halpern, a veteran Lower East Side resident, felt sympathetic towards this stranger, who was apparently a very dignified person on a peaceful mission. Okay, we'll continue a little bit. Hippies, what are they? Communists? While the young taunted, the middle-aged and elderly shook their heads or stared, cold and uncomprehending. The way to the park was spotted with blasphemies, ribald jokes and tension, but no violence. After the successful kirtan in Washington Square Park, Prabhupada had regularly been sending out parades of 3 or 4 devotees, chanting and playing hand cymbals to the streets and sidewalks of the Lower East Side. On one occasion, they had been bombarded with water balloons and eggs, and they were sometimes faced with bullies looking for a fight. But they were never attacked, just stared at, laughed at, or shouted after. Today, the ethnic neighbors just assumed that Prabhupada and his followers had come into the streets dressed in outlandish costumes as a joke, just to turn everything topsy-turvy and cause tears and holes. They felt that their responses were only natural for any normal, respectable American